Okay, I'll start and then we'll jump in and with introductions and so on. So, as you recall, with our advisory committee, that we were going to have monthly updates. So the committee has had 2 meetings since we've last heard an update at the board level. If you recall, the first one was a lot of information gathering. We've had an opportunity now for a little bit of discussion. You know, from the committee, a few of you have had an opportunity to attend. So we'd like to first give an opportunity for a little bit of an update about what they've been working on. Then obviously time for dialogue back and forth and questions and comments and so on. For board members, just as a reference, the actual presentation from last night, we just got uploaded this afternoon. We had some technical issues and we got it cleaned up and it's there. And then you have some handouts of some of the key slides. That's not all of them. There were like 50 slides, but those are the kind of the key ones. Okay, and so with that, well, I'll let you guys introduce yourselves, even though I think most everyone is known here, certainly, but to make sure that all of our board members are aware of who we have with us, and we'll turn it over to our committee members.
I'm Pat Howell. I'm a resident in Monona and retired teacher from the district.
Kind of retired.
I'm sorry, what?
Kind of retired.
Kind of retired.
I'm David Peterson. I live in Cottage Grove. I have 2 students currently in the district, and
Jason McCutcheon, live in Cottage Grove and used to sit on that side of the table.
I heard that.
so yeah, I guess Dan, we can kind of give a synopsis. I don't know if you want us to read this.
I don't know, you have to go through every, the board does have a copy of that as well.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I you know, from a synopsis perspective, we've had two meetings since we've last met. So meetings 3 and 4 total. In meeting 3, we were presented the options, option A and option B, which were developed by the last committee in 2015. There was lots of conversation in that particular meeting. In that meeting, we actually came up with a third option, or discussed a third option, option C, that you'll read in your materials. In last night's meeting that we met, that was meeting 4, we talked about, additionally, we talked more about what those options, kind of the implications of that. We met in a Socratic circle, so all Cottage Grove folks met in the middle, and then Monona on the outside. Monona wasn't allowed to talk, and then after 20 minutes, we switched, and Cottage Grove got to sit on the outside and didn't get to talk. And we learned a lot, actually, at least I thought so, during that session, about the options and talked about all 3 options. And then after that, we got together and talked about the price for each option. And I think that's where a lot of conversation really kind of blossomed from there. So that's kind of the synopsis. Did I miss anything? Or
No, good.
just represent anything? So I think we can kind of talk through some of the pricing, I think, maybe, or if we want to talk about the options, I think we can kind of take this conversation a couple different ways. Just want to see if there's any kind of raw questions off the cuff, maybe. Keep going, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I guess I'm a little confused. This is my first meeting with you guys, but
Okay.
I've talked to them. I thought going into this, we had a good idea. Everyone said we have a good idea where we're at, right, as a board. I thought as a board, community schools was completely off the table, and now I see community schools as part of this deal. So that's why I'm confused.
Well,
May I?
please.
I'll try. So I have been an observer attendee, and what I might summarize, and you'll please assist me.
Yep.
A piece of what we were looking for through this advisory committee were voices and perspectives from both of our communities. So as anticipated, even though we had some critical discussions, right, a while ago and came to our own conclusion, that topic of neighborhood or community schools came up again because there are members of our communities that value that model. And it didn't seem appropriate to just stop that conversation because it was a part of what was brought into the advisory conversation. And so I think there was a value in having people hear that out and in processing that and having our construction and our architectural people think and process through that as well, and helping our group, right, go through that and at least have those options on the table imagine what the values and the challenges might be. So just as we had an opportunity to process that, I think it was important for this group to have
We
an
actually had
opportunity.
2 meetings that lasted a long time with the architects, and both meetings came to the same conclusion
Right.
that they're not gonna work.
So
So-
if I could just to jump in here, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I can comment, and it's in the notes here, right? From when we talk about option A, which is the neighborhood school option, the idea, right? And again, just for the sake of conversation here, right? The idea is to add a new school in Cottage Grove, 1st through 5th at Cottage Grove School, 1st through 5th at the new school. Throughout our conversation, the last, at least especially last night, it was generally, and correct me if I'm wrong, generally panned for the
Right.
most part. We did not remove it off the table because we don't want to, at this point, I don't think the committee really wants to remove any options, right? We want to know more information. So we asked for things like mill rates, we asked for operating costs, right? We know, the more information we have, the better we can to help inform you guys. But in speaking in generalities, I think, especially for Cottage Grove residents, I think no one was absolutely gung ho. I think there's one particular person who played devil's advocate, and I think that's good for a group like this. But to your kind of your point, it was generally panned, and I don't think anybody was really willing to have that, especially for the folks that live in Cottage Grove. For the folks in Monona, it was generally the feeling was we don't have kids in Cottage Grove, so I can't really comment on which one or the other. Several folks made the comment to the Monona residents, well, you're still paying for it, so it's okay to have an opinion here. And still, no one was willing to kind of, from Monona's side, really make a hard and fast.
I did get the sense, though, that the Cottage Grove members were heard and concurred with.
It just seems to me, I mean, everybody finds it valuable, we have a lot to do, it's just a wasted everybody's time.
Well,
Our board and their board.
I would just piggyback onto that a little bit in that I don't know that it's a waste of time because it's actually, as you look at the numbers, it's a cheaper option to go to neighborhood schools.
Right.
Which, not to just do things strictly for dollars, but, there are pros and cons with each method. So at some point, dollars do become a factor into this. So I think for us to not consider it at all would be a slap in the face of the process. Because we've got to put forward a recommendation that we weren't sure what you guys had yet, that, this committee's, embracing. So that's got to be included as one of the potential options right now.
Actually, that's what scared me the most, is what if it comes back to the cheapest option, because it's an impossible.
Okay, so I've got 3 hands up around the board. I think yours was first, so Susan, and then Carrie. Thank you.
I wanted to add, I think David's done a really nice job of, it was kind of startling to see how he set up the discussion groups last night. But there was one Cottage Grove person who said, based on the research and what appears to be academically best for our students, I would support this option. That continues to be the reason it's still out there for discussion. Can you sell that referendum piece even if it's a lower cost? The answer consistently from the group at the Inner Circle from Cottage Grove said, no, you won't be able to sell this. So they weren't supporting it because they don't think it'll pass versus it's not a good idea. There were people who felt that this was really educationally a good idea. And at least 1 or 2 people spoke to that. So I thought it was interesting to hear those pieces. Understanding that's the reason we gave it up, because we couldn't sell it. Not because it wasn't academically and based on research one of the best options.
I think it's
Well, I think the other
We
point,
gave it to you. Stacks
I don't
of
think
it.
we need to get into an argument
Okay.
here about
No.
this, but I think the other point that was discussed was that the more informed these 20 people are as to the pros and cons of all of these options, the better they are prepared to talk to members of the community, because these questions will come up. If, for example, that one is not the one that goes with it, I would agree from everything I heard, that was not the favorite option. But at the end, when they were asked, should we take one of these off the table, the answer was no, because we'd like you to flesh out costs a little more. These are very preliminary costs, that's why it's such a big range. But if you aren't going to go with that option, for example, you need to explain to the public, why aren't we going with the cheapest one? And you need to have good reasons for it. So I think it's very important that they had this discussion. And it was interesting to me. To me, it validates the discussions we had, because they're coming to similar conclusions. So I think it was absolutely appropriate and worthwhile, and I appreciate all the work that you've done on it.
Thank you, Carrie.
Yeah, I was thinking about Jeff's comment that it does seem like a retread of work we did. However, it's gonna take a lot to get the whole community educated to the point where they will buy in to a plan that you and I maybe could have called out 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, just saying, just joking about that, but like, right? So it's gonna take a long time to get people in the community to understand the depth and breadth of the information that will get to a good decision that we can put to them on a referendum question. And so even though I'm super impatient about it, it's no good if I'm the only one that, you know, like, this is what I want, yes, and then 99% of the people vote no. Like, that's not gonna, so I really see the time spent as a reasonable and smart way to make sure there's education in the community to get people to consensus prior to a referendum that could be derailed by having not had the investment up front in the time to get them there, even though, so I'm sympathetic to your comment.
To go
but-
one,
Okay, yeah.
oh, sorry.
No, no,
but then I wanted to get them
Yeah,
on
we
with their,
wanna
yeah.
get you
To
back.
go one further, just to add on to that, right, having all the information is always the best option here, right? And so that's the whole reason why we've actually added 2 additional options, C1 and C2.
Mhm.
We're not even
Good.
when we went to the 3rd meeting, those weren't even options on the table, right? And so there's a lot of conversation going on around what we know today from a committee perspective. We haven't even got to the high school yet, right? And we know, and this board knows that there's potential space issues sooner rather than later there, right? So from my perspective, there's 4 options on the table today, and we haven't even talked about the high school yet, right? At the next meeting, we're gonna talk about the high school. I think you may end up with a C3 or a D1, or who knows how many options we're gonna end up with. Because today, the committee doesn't have all the information that you have, right? And so I think, if I had to guess, right, I think there might be a potential additional option than we already have available to us.
So keep at it.
Are there any specific questions you want us to go back to the committee with, or?
Let me say again.
Yeah,
because
sure.
I think it needs to be said every time I see something. That wasn't a cut on you guys, right?
Oh, sure.
That was not a cut on the work you did at all.
Mhm.
It just seems like we wasted 8 hours of our time. So.
And since the board members aren't attending your committee meetings, can you share with us the flavor of the
Sure.
conversation around these different options? Are you at a point where you could share? I'm curious.
From my perspective, and you guys chime in, I think the more information we get as we've looked at the enrollment projections, we're looking at the schools, we've looked at cost now and the different plans, and the more information we get, the deeper we dig, I think more questions are coming up, and as you just mentioned too, that we start seeing more options. Again, from my perspective too, the discussion last night with the 2 different communities, I think really brought to the surface how much, even though we're very different, the communities are very different as a whole. There are opportunities in both places to really enhance what we do as a whole district, and we haven't gotten there yet, but I think the doors are opening for more discussion on that will be hopefully very rich and expand the options. And one of them, I think, has to do with, as we look 20 years down the road, it is so difficult to project what's going to happen and how to do that right. How within this whole plan do we create some fluency, some flow that allows some flexibility for change over time, and also really enhances what Cottage Grove has to offer as an evolving community with a lot of green space, Monona with a more contained community with opportunities to interact with the greater community. So those are all things that are just starting to come up.
So don't you think, I mean, I think the communities are different on the outside, but don't you think on the inside they're not? In terms of, we have kids in the district, like no one's ever said, oh, they're from Monona, you know? Oh, they're from Cottage Grove. I mean, they look at kids and see kids, right? They don't see Monona and Cottage Grove kids. They aren't fighting the battles that we're fighting out here, or used to fight out here, and hopefully don't fight anymore, but I don't know about that.
That's not the sense that I have. I would agree, Jeff. And my kids were raised in the district. I lived in Monona, but I've got 4 grandkids out in Cottage Grove. I've got a Girl Scout troop out in Cottage Grove. I have never once heard
Right. Never
that issue. I don't think
There's
that's
never been
where
a Star
we're
Valley
at.
Sneetches and no
Yeah.
Sneetches.
Yeah. I don't think that's where we're
There was
at.
one individual, because I've got it down on the questions that the board had asked last time, that, you know, what are the cultural and social aspects of the buildings? And one of the parents brought up the fact that the 6th graders from Monona, some of them are having a hard time melding into GDS with the 6th grade there. And one of the thoughts was that it's because the 5th graders have already been in the building
Right.
for a year.
Mm-hmm.
So that is an issue. There are some kids that aren't melding at that first brush with joining up because of that issue.
That's a transition issue, though, not a, we don't
Well,
want them because they're
But it's,
strangers, right?
yeah, but whatever it is, it's, you know, it is an issue that's gotta be addressed or in some form or fashion. So, you know, that was one of the concerns. Before we get too far off, you know, there are a couple of the other questions that you guys had asked last time is, what happens to GDS if we remove the 5th grade? The capacity, based on what we've got last night, is that it's under capacity for 18, 19 years before it really becomes an issue. So removing 5th grade is probably pretty vital to that school from GDS. And then the other one that was limiting factors, you know, capacity, whether it was classrooms or common areas, and for the most part, it's common areas. So, I mean, those are kind of the things we've learned based on the question you guys asked last time, that we can report back quickly.
Is there anything you wanted to add to my other question about how you would characterize the conversation that was happening around these options?
You know, it's, I don't want to say this. When we got into the circles and it was Cottage Grove in the middle and Monona on the outside, when he first said that, I just rolled my eyes. And I'm like, you know, I've sat through too many things where it's been this versus them mentality. And I don't get that sense through this group. I think there's strong supporters of wanting to reopen Maywood, but I think there's justifiable and for good reasons. However, when the proposal we saw last night was to make Maywood a middle school, that didn't get received well. It was told,
That didn't fly well at all.
it did not fly well. Maywood is an elementary school. You know, so that part didn't go. But I think as far as the rest of us interacting, I think it's been from having 20 people, 10 from each community, I think it's a very respectful, honest, good discussion, and lots of thought provoking. I haven't seen anybody storm off. I haven't heard of anybody, you know, casting stones after the fact or any of that stuff. So I think that part's good. But I think there are, you know, certain topics, whether it's the transitions versus neighborhood. There's some that are passionate one way or the other. Maywood being open, some are passionate more than others, even within their own community. So I think that's also good because it gives you different perspectives for that community, you know.
Thank you.
So.
Peter?
I'd like to comment that looking at these different configurations without the differences in operating costs is problematic because building a school with a referendum, a capital referendum, that's an expense that's not under the caps. The operating expenses are. So $500,000 in operating expenses equals, you know, over 20 years, $10 million of capital expenses.
Mm-hmm.
But it's worse for us because it's out of our cap, it's under our cap, and that means we have to reduce expenses elsewhere, you know, in classrooms in order to do that. So it's important if you're going to look at these different options that we look at in tandem with it, the operating expenses.
Yeah, and we talked about a little bit about that last night. You know, if there is a new school, what would that cost from an operating standpoint?
Mm-hmm.
Bringing in administration, bringing in the school nurse, bringing in all of those other things. What would Maywood add to that if we bring Maywood back online? I just heard MG21 want to expand. What does that do to this, you know, as a brand new wrinkle tonight? How much more does that add to the operating budget? Because there is only limited funds.
In the context I'm going to bring this up in is your option C1 and C2, where we split the middle school. And back in 2004, we had a referendum along those lines. I believe the additional operating costs we calculated at the time was $500,000 to have to essentially
you're
have
right.
2 middle schools. We also have this 2009 report from Patty
Yep.
about the expenses there. And I don't think that that's, also if we go into a small middle school in Monona, this is uncharted territory. We have a unified middle school that we believe is working well. We've never had, as far as I know, a middle school with 250 students in it, or fewer actually than middle students. It would be a very big change and very uncharted territory.
Yeah.
There would be in additional expenses, there would be compromises and opportunities.
Yeah.
And the other thing I have to say about these options is that this community looked at these in 2004. We put this in front of the community, and 90% of the people in Monona voted against splitting the middle school and having 2 middle schools in the district. There were 117 people who voted for it, and I can speak on this because I was one of them. Okay, in Monona. And I think this is an option we put on the table, and I really don't think we should be going there again. Now, I understand your role in this, which is to look at all the options and evaluate these things. I think it's our role as a board to look at these options and say, and sort of put some stakes in the sand and make some of the decisions. And I would look to my board members and say, this is great, this is really good information, understand this, but I think we should direct the committee at this point to put their energy into options A and B rather than the option C. Because I don't think ultimately that these are financially, educationally, or politically viable options.
So to be clear, right, option C came up with the assumption was made that if you split middle school, you wouldn't have to build a new school. That was the assumption that several folks in the committee had. So go back to the drawing board and come back and tell us, well, we sat down yesterday and it's like, oh, you still need a new school. So it was kind of, I think that left a lot of folks like, what do we do now, right? Like, and then we actually got into the conversation around the high school, and it was like, well, what do we really do now, right? So we left with, I think, more questions than we had answers last night. And I really like at first I didn't like the approach of piecemeal, like there's a big picture here and we're just taking one piece off at a time. At first I didn't really appreciate that. I think now personally I kind of appreciate that, because if they were to show us the whole picture all at once, I think it would just evolve into an argument every meeting. And so we had really good conversation, and even though we all know we're not dealing with a full deck, we don't have all the information yet, and we can have good, honest conversation, pragmatic conversation. Again, if we had all the data,
I attended one of the meetings just to see how the process went and how it was going, and I was very much impressed with the openness and the discussion and the details that everyone was getting into. And like you said, I think exploring the options is your job, and then winning one down is our job.
Susan?
Well, and it was discussed last night that on the agenda at the next meeting are the operational costs. And I think part of it is, as you said, it is a little piecemeal, but part of it is how much information can you absorb at one time, and it is a big picture. So there's a conscious plan to build toward that, so they will be discussing that at the next meeting. And I think, we went into this saying there aren't foregone conclusions in terms of timing, in terms of scope. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that last night they talked a lot about the maintenance needs, capital maintenance needs, and I did a little bit of a double take even at the cost, and we thought, so because it was higher than I thought, and so I think I am extremely impressed with how this is going. I've been fortunate to go to a couple of these meetings, and I think they're very well conducted. The people are participating at a high level and very thoughtful, very good questions, and I think we have something to gain from what you all talk about and the questions you're bringing up as well in terms of planning down the road, because we're still looking at short-term, long-term, overall with the significant needs we have in this district. And so I think this whole process is great, and that was definitely it was announced last night that because they were a little frustrated too with not getting the operating costs. And that was the response, is that that's a whole other complex area, and we will get that to the next meeting, so it'll be there.
I guess my point on the operating expenses is that it's not one-to-one. It's because of the
Oh,
caps.
right.
The operating expenses are sort of,
And
in a
I'm sure
sense,
they'll
much
talk
more
about
important
that.
to us.
They'll obviously
Yeah.
talk about that, because that's a big factor. When they ask the mill rate question, that all comes up, so, yeah.
Susan?
Well, I think the other thing that we need as a board to understand is what we've done with this committee. And I think it's critically important that we look at the charge that we charged this committee with. That was our job, and it's what we did. And to remove a piece of that charge, because we, right now, don't think they should spend their time looking at it, I think is not within our scope. The charge is, the Facilities Advisory Committee has been charged with developing long-term facilities options. So one of the things they've been charged with is developing these options, and sitting and watching the group work. It wasn't just one person. There were several people that wanted that to be studied. Study it and then tell us you like it or you don't like it and why. The other thing that's really interesting is if you go and watch, it's the learning process that's going on in there. Learning about open enrollment and what we do about open enrollment. I mean, the committee got really hung up on that at one of the last meetings, because people didn't know what it was. They thought we took everybody that applied. They didn't understand that there's rules and regulations on capacity and class size. The other thing they got all hung up on was class size. And as they look at configurations, those are critically important learning achievement things that need to be studied. So again, this committee is walking you through that. They spent a ton of time on the costs, and they're gonna go back and do it again. The guy was up there for close to 45 minutes last night, talking to you guys about costs and building in, if you do this, then this is how it could affect you. So they're getting that piece, and I appreciate the fact of the respectful behavior in that group. Weren't you a little surprised? Again, I watched
Well, I'm
that
not
same
surprised. I
thing.
think it's acting like an adult,
So
but I've heard it go the other way.
It is so commendable, and that
Yeah,
they had
no,
a
it's been great.
really
Yeah.
good discussion about the issues,
Yeah,
even in that environment.
it's
So
been a
I
great-
commend the group for the work they're doing. Incredible.
Thank you. I have Dean and then Carrie.
I've gone to a couple of them, and I think you're working through the issues, even though we talked about a few of them before. I think I kinda hollered out at the meeting before last, to recognize that the city of Madison can annex anything into the town of Cottage Grove. And housing policies, for the city of Madison, could substantially impact the social economic distribution. Witness the southwest, northwest areas of Madison, in which school districts are constantly trying to transport and move kids around to get social diversion. To make it, everything could be $1 million homes, but at certain times I've read that their planning policies are lower cost housing on the periphery as opposed to downtown. So that could affect this. And not that we don't educate all the children of all the people, but it has a lot to do with the concentration of kids and potential busing. That's down the pike, but I would feel more comfortable if it were, if we didn't have a township there that had limited restrictions to control annexation and that sort of thing. I think that has a lot to do with, in my thinking, where I like the neighborhood school, if you end up with two neighborhood schools type of thing, you're going to constantly be redrawing boundary lines to balance enrollment and things like that. So,
one of the big
other than that, I'm impressed by the process that you're making and the mix of people in your discussion.
Thank you, Carrie.
Just a minor point, which is receiving this as a board member and having the page that says overall cost summary. and then having the somewhat sticker shock of someone next to me saying, but wait, $500,000 a year operating expenses that aren't really acknowledged on this overall cost summary. So, and I'm feeling stupid that that didn't occur to me until you said it. So I guess I'm just thinking about that and maybe retitling this in my own mind, initial construction cost summary or something. Would be just a way to think about that when we're seeing things like this, because I went, oh, right, I feel a little bit like.
That did come up in conversation,
Okay.
right? So like, is this everything, or is this?
And,
right?
until
and
you brought it
that
up, I
answer.
was sort of like, well, okay, and yet,
Yep.
yes,
Yeah.
7 schools is gonna be more expensive to operate than 6 schools,
Yep.
for example, and,
Yep.
and that very major thing.
Yeah, this is just a construction.
Yes, which is now clear to me, but wasn't so much as I was
Not,
looking at
not anything
this,
to do
right?
with how we operate it after, if they're built or remodeled or.
Right on, and in the
Because
context of what you're working on, which
that's-
you were only working on
You know,
construction.
and that's part of it, is people start looking at this and seeing this. There's also, it's not just building a school that goes in this, there's extensive remodel in all of the schools. There's remodeling everywhere, some of them are more extensive than others, some areas are more extensive than others. So it's not just that piece of it, it's not just a school that's, you know, $500,000 or $50,000 or $50 million.
Yes, I know it's not a surprise to people who were in the room looking at that, it was just more a comment of the disconnects between having the board not part of that conversation, and then we get the product of it
Yeah.
without seeing how it fits in.
Or
And I know
sticker
that's
shock
by
of it,
design,
that's
but, but it's a complication of not having all of us hear what they're all hearing, you know?
And back to Susan's point, you know, that seeing the maintenance that has been deferred over the years, and the sticker shock on that, I think was pretty eye-opening. When, you know, it's $16 million that's needed pretty urgently, and half of that goes to Winnequa. You know, those two numbers, I think, were a big surprise for a lot of people in the room. So, it is what it is, but, you know, that's probably not what we were expecting when you start seeing this. Now that 16 million is included in here, in each
Yes.
of these numbers, so.
We saw that
as
on the
people-
charts.
Yeah, so as people start looking at that thing, we just wanna make sure that everybody's aware of that.
Yeah,
It's not
those
on
are great.
top of that.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay, so I've got Dean and then we'll.
Yeah,
go back.
I just, when people talk about grade configuration, since I've lived in Monona for a number of years, I've seen every possible grade configuration, and every school and every teacher and every student has survived. I think Winnequa at one time was a kindergarten 7-8. And you find a place and you deal with it. Not that it's ideal, and you need to think you're doing the right thing when you, at least for the first year when you plan, but they will change over the years,
Yeah.
and people will find ways to make do.
Well, I think that's one of the first things Dan said as we started, you know, very back in meeting 1. However the configurations lay out, is the district can make it work. It's what do we feel is best as a starting point,
Yeah.
you know, with the idea that nothing's ever written in stone.
Just 2 quick points. First of all, just a reminder, when we're talking about those maintenance needs, the long-range study that was done 2.5 years ago came up with $14 million estimate of deferred maintenance. Now, 2.5 years later, we're at 16 million. So that's not a new number, you know, so to speak. But the other real important point when we talk about operational, and this committee is going to address that, and this board, that's going to be a really important piece when it comes back to you in the decision-making piece. Most communities, when they go to referendum for a facility, there'll be a second referendum question for operational costs, and that has a very different impact on the mill rate and so on as well. So, yeah, this committee will have a chance to review that. That'll be one of the big decision-making points for this board as well, about trying to absorb versus, referendum or a combination of both.
Yeah.
So a lot of these things have 4K1, share the prairie.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean we're gonna pull out of our agreements with the local daycares and
That'll
hire
be a
more
discussion
teachers?
this board will have at a future time. There's been no discussion of that with this committee. But certainly that factors into future decision-making, yes. I'll just say, my understanding is that historically this board has supported the idea of meeting parent preference, that we'd have enough 4K sites in the buildings for the parents that would like that, and then the community sites for the parents that would like that wraparound care. So that's where we're at currently, of trying to have that balance. If that were to change, that'd be something this board would have to discuss.
And can you share out the date of
Oh, thank you.
Yep.
So the discussion that came up with the additional option, we we ran short of time at the previous meeting, so we have scheduled an additional meeting. So on January 30th, of next Tuesday, so they'll go back to back, and so we can get,
You said January 30th?
January 30th will be an additional meeting that was not on the original schedule. Okay, we'll make sure we get that out and right into everyone.
Next one's January 9, right?
Yeah, their next meeting is January 9th.
9, 23, and 30.
So they'll have 3 in January.
Well, yes, the 4K, the wraparound care on the 4K is important to participation for some parents. That's why we have to be careful about that.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you need from us?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your work.
Is anyone ready to quit that committee yet?
No.